At 0630 on March 1, 1943, Major Ed Larner stood on the rain-soaked coral runway at Port Moresby, watching his B-25 Mitchell bomber crews prepare for a mission that higher command had already called impossible. 31 years old, 72 combat missions, 0 ships sunk. The Japanese had dispatched 8 troop transports and 8 destroyers from Rabaul, carrying nearly 7,000 soldiers to reinforce their garrison at Leh. American intelligence had intercepted the convoy's departure. Every transport that reached Leh meant another division the Allies would have to dig out of the jungle with blood. Larner's problem was simple. Traditional bombing from 10,000 feet gave ships too much time to maneuver. Japanese captains watched American bombers climb to altitude, calculated the bomb trajectory, and turned their vessels away from the splash zones. 5th Air Force B-17s had been trying to hit Japanese convoys for 8 months. Hit rate? 3%. Most bombs exploded harmlessly in empty ocean while the ship steamed on. The mathematics were brutal. A 1,000-pound bomb dropped from altitude took 37 seconds to hit water. In those 37 seconds, a destroyer traveling at 30 knots covered 380 yards, more than 3 football fields. The bombardier aimed at where the ship was. The bomb hit where the ship used to be. Larner had watched it happen mission after mission. Bombers would come back with perfect bombing photographs showing tight patterns around the ships. Around them, never on them. Crews reported direct hits that turned out to be near misses. The Japanese kept sailing. American bomber losses kept climbing. His squadron had lost 4 aircraft in the past month trying to hit convoys. 40 men. The Japanese shot down high-altitude bombers with methodical precision. Their gunners had time to track the approach, calculate the lead, and bracket the formation with flak. By the time bombs fell, half the squadron was burning. General George Kenney, commanding 5th Air Force, had proposed something that sounded insane to every pilot who heard it. Skip the bomb across the water like a flat stone. Fly in at 50 feet. Release the bomb 300 yards out with a 5-second delay fuse. Let momentum carry it into the ship's hull. The bomb would skip once, maybe twice, then detonate on contact or just under the waterline. The theorists said it would work. The pilots said it was suicide. Flying a twin-engine bomber at 50 feet above ocean swells, straight at a ship bristling with anti-aircraft guns, violated every survival instinct Larner had developed. Japanese destroyers carried 127mm main guns, 25mm machine cannons, and dozens of lighter weapons. All of them could track a bomber at that altitude. One solid hit to the engine, and the B-25 would cartwheel into the sea before the crew could blink. Higher command had banned the tactic twice. Too dangerous, too experimental, unproven. Larner's request to practice skip bombing had been denied in December and again in January. The official response called it reckless disregard for equipment and personnel. Air crews needed to focus on proven high-altitude tactics. But high-altitude tactics weren't sinking ships. If you want to see how Larner's skip bombing experiment turned out, please hit that like button. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Pacific War. Subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Larner. Larner walked to the operations tent and spread reconnaissance photographs across the planning table. The Japanese convoy had been spotted at dawn, steaming southeast through the Bismarck Sea. 8 fat transports in 2 columns, destroyers screening the flanks. Every ship packed with soldiers, artillery, ammunition. If those transports reached Leh, the war in New Guinea would grind on for another year. He had an idea that would either vindicate Kenney's faith in low-altitude attacks or get 60 American air crews killed before lunch. The convoy would pass within striking range at 0900. 3 hours to prepare, 3 hours to teach his pilots to fly like they'd never flown before. Larner called his squadron leaders to the tent and laid out the plan they'd been forbidden to practice. The B-25 Mitchell wasn't designed for what Larner was asking. The bomber had been built to hit targets from medium altitude with a level bombing approach. Its twin Wright Cyclone engines could push it to 300 miles per hour in level flight. But that speed meant nothing if Japanese gunners had 30 seconds to track the approach. Kenny's modification changed everything. 5th Air Force mechanics had ripped out the bombardier position in the nose and installed 8 50 caliber machine guns pointing forward, 4 in the nose, 4 in blisters on the fuselage sides. The B-25 had become a flying gun platform that could put 200 rounds per second into a target. The theory was simple: suppress the ship's anti-aircraft guns with machine gun fire during the approach, give the gunners a reason to duck, make them choose between returning fire and surviving. Larner had watched mechanics bolt the guns onto his aircraft 3 weeks earlier. The modification added 1,200 pounds. It shifted the center of gravity forward. It turned his bomber into something between an attack aircraft and a maritime strike fighter, something that had never existed before. The practice runs had been conducted in secret. Kenny had found a wreck called the Pruth, a 4,700-ton steamer that had run aground on Nadera Reef near Port Moresby in 1924. The rusting hulk sat half-submerged, a perfect target. Larner's crews flew practice runs at dawn and dusk when the light was bad and observers were few. They learned to skim the wave tops at 270 miles per hour. They learned to time the bomb release. They learned what happened when you got it wrong. Lieutenant Jake Fawcett had gotten it wrong on February 16th. He'd come in too high, 70 feet instead of 50. The bomb had skipped twice, cleared the Pruth entirely, and detonated 300 yards beyond the wreck. Fawcett's bombardier, Sergeant Mike Russo, had recalculated. Lower, faster, closer release point. The next run, Fawcett came in at 45 feet. The bomb skipped once and slammed into the Pruth's hull just below the waterline, right where a ship's magazine would be, right where one bomb could detonate 1,000 tons of ammunition and blow a destroyer in half. But the Pruth wasn't shooting back. Larner spread the reconnaissance photos across the briefing table and pointed to the lead transport. 800 feet long, displacing 10,000 tons, capable of carrying 1,500 troops. The convoy's flagship. Every officer in the tent knew what was at stake. Japanese reinforcements had turned Buna into a 6-month nightmare that had cost 5,000 Allied casualties. Leh would be worse if those transports unloaded. The mathematics of skip bombing required precision most bomber crews had never attempted. Approach altitude, 50 feet above the water. Approach speed, 270 miles per hour. Release point, 300 yards from target. Bomb trajectory angle, 8 degrees. Delay fuse, 5 seconds. Miss any one variable, and the bomb would either skip over the ship, detonate short, or hit the water at the wrong angle and sink without detonating. Larner assigned each pilot a specific target. Transport 1 through Transport 8. Destroyers as secondary targets if the transports were already burning. No bomber would attack the same ship twice. Maximum efficiency, maximum destruction. One pass, one bomb, one chance. The crews filed out to their aircraft at 0700. 54 men and 9 B-25s. Behind them, 13 Beaufighters from the Royal Australian Air Force would strafe the convoy first, suppressing anti-aircraft fire. Above them, 16 B-17 Flying Fortresses would bomb from altitude, forcing the Japanese ships to maneuver and breaking up their formations. The P-38 Lightning fighters would keep Japanese Zeros busy at high altitude. But the killing blow would come from Larner's 9 bombers at 50 feet. He climbed into his aircraft at 0715. His co-pilot, Lieutenant Tom Benz, was already running through the pre-flight checklist. The bombardier, Staff Sergeant Carl Walls, was checking the bomb release mechanism for the 4th time. Nobody spoke. The entire crew had flown together for 9 months. They knew what a 50-foot approach meant. They knew the odds. Larner started the port engine, then the starboard. The right cyclones caught and settled into their familiar roar. Around him, 8 other B-25s were winding up. The formation would take off in flights of 3. Larner's flight first. Stay low over the water the entire way. Japanese radar couldn't track aircraft below 100 feet. Surprise was the only advantage they had. At 07:45, Larner released the brakes and began his takeoff roll. By 09:30, he would know if Kenny's theory worked, or if he'd just led his entire squadron into a slaughter. The flight to the Bismarck Sea took 90 minutes. Larner kept his formation at 30 feet above the ocean, low enough that spray from the wave tops occasionally spattered his windscreen. The B-25s flew in a loose V formation, each aircraft separated by 200 yards, close enough to maintain visual contact, far enough that one burst of flak couldn't take down two bombers. Radio silence. The Japanese monitored every frequency. One transmission and the convoy would know American bombers were inbound. Surprise was worth more than coordination. Larner checked his watch. 08:30. The convoy should be 60 miles northeast, steaming at 12 knots toward the Vitiaz Strait. Right on schedule according to the morning reconnaissance report. The ocean below was empty. No whitecaps, no Japanese patrol boats, just endless blue water stretching to the horizon in every direction. Flying this low, Larner couldn't see more than 5 miles. The convoy could be anywhere. His navigation had to be perfect. 5 degrees off course and they'd miss the target entirely. Come up on the convoy from the wrong angle and the destroyers would have time to bring their main guns to bear. At 08:52, Larner spotted smoke on the horizon. Black diesel exhaust from 16 ships steaming in formation. He keyed his throat microphone once. Click. The signal to tighten formation. His wingmen acknowledged with single clicks. Radio discipline, holding. The convoy took shape as they closed. 2 columns of transports, 4 ships per column. The destroyers formed a protective screen 2 miles ahead and on both flanks. Larner counted gun positions on the nearest destroyer. 6 main turrets, dozens of smaller weapons. Every gun would be tracking his approach once they broke the horizon. At 08:57, the Beaufighters went in. Larner watched from 3 miles out as 13 Australian aircraft dove on the convoy from the northeast. Their 20mm cannons raked the destroyer decks. Tracers arced across the water. The Japanese anti-aircraft guns swung toward the new threat, exactly as planned. The Beaufighters weren't there to sink ships. They were there to make the gunners look the wrong direction. 30 seconds later, the B-17s arrived at 10,000 feet. Larner saw the bomb bay doors open. Bombs tumbled toward the convoy. The Japanese ships began evasive maneuvers, turning hard to port and starboard. Columns broke apart. Spacing increased. The destroyers accelerated to flank speed, white water foaming at their sterns. Confusion. Perfect. Larner pulled back on the throttles and descended to 40 feet. His airspeed dropped to 260 miles per hour. Walls, his bombardier, was calling out distances. 4,000 yards, 3,800, 3,600. Each ship in the convoy was now clearly visible. Larner picked his target. The second transport in the port column, 700 feet long, sitting low in the water, fully loaded. His bomb would hit amidships, right where the troop compartments were packed with soldiers. The destroyer on the left flank spotted them. Larner saw muzzle flashes. The first shells arced toward his formation. Too high. The Japanese gunners were used to tracking bombers at altitude. They hadn't adjusted for a 50-foot approach. Yet. At 2,000 yards, Larner opened fire. All 8 50 caliber machine guns hammered. Tracers walked across the transport's superstructure. Glass shattered. Metal sparked. Men on deck dropped or dove for cover. The suppression was working. The anti-aircraft crews couldn't shoot back while half-inch bullets were tearing through their positions at 800 rounds per minute. 1,200 yards. Larner's wingmen were spreading out, each bomber lining up on its assigned target. The formation was fragmenting by design. 9 bombers attacking 9 ships simultaneously. No time for the defenders to shift fire. No time to coordinate a response. 800 yards. The destroyer's main guns fired again. This time the shells bracketed Larner's flight. Left, right. Close enough to rock the aircraft with concussion. Shrapnel pinged off the fuselage. Benz, the co-pilot, called out damage. Port engine oil pressure dropping. Still in the green. 600 yards. The transport filled Larner's windscreen. He could see individual soldiers on deck, scrambling for cover. Could see the bridge windows. Could see the ship's gun crews swinging their weapons toward him. Every instinct screamed to pull up, to climb, to get away from the wall of steel rushing toward him at a combined closing speed of 300 miles per hour. 400 yards. Waltz's voice cut through the engine roar. Bomb armed, ready for release. 300 yards. Larner pressed the bomb release. He felt the aircraft lurch upward as 1,000 pounds dropped free. The bomb tumbled forward, carried by momentum. It hit the water nose first, skipped once like a flat stone, and arrowed toward the transport's hull. Larner pulled hard on the control yoke and climbed. Behind him, the 5-second fuse was counting down. The bomb detonated at the waterline. Larner didn't see the explosion. He was climbing hard, his vision filled with sky. But he felt it. The shockwave hit his aircraft like a physical blow, lifting the tail and throwing the B-25 sideways. Benz fought the controls. The altimeter spun through 100 feet, 200, 300. Larner risked a glance back. The transport was splitting open. A column of fire and black smoke erupted from amidships. The hull buckled. Metal shrieked. Secondary explosions rippled through the superstructure as ammunition stores cooked off. The ship listed to port, already taking water through the massive hole torn in its side. Soldiers were jumping overboard, dozens of them, tiny figures abandoning a dying ship. One bomb. 15 seconds from release to catastrophic damage. The skip bombing worked. To Larner's right, Lieutenant Jake Fawcett's bomber was pulling up from its own attack run. Another transport was burning, flames climbing its forward mast. To the left, Captain Bill Hayes had just released on a destroyer. The bomb skipped twice and hit below the aft turret. The destroyer's stern lifted out of the water from the internal explosion. When it crashed back down, the entire rear third of the ship was missing. The destroyer began settling by the stern, sinking fast. 4 targets hit in the first 90 seconds. The Japanese convoy was in chaos. But the defenders were adapting. A destroyer on the far flank had turned to face the bombers. Its main guns fired in rapid succession. The shells walked across the water toward Lieutenant Tom Mitchell's B-25. The first shell missed by 50 yards, the second by 20. The third hit. Mitchell's aircraft disintegrated. The bomb under the fuselage detonated on impact. The explosion vaporized the bomber instantly. No parachutes, no survivors. 5 men gone between one heartbeat and the next. Larner watched the debris scatter across the water. No time to process it, no time to mourn. The attack was still happening. The remaining B-25s pressed their attacks. Lieutenant Carl Johnson lined up on the lead transport, the convoy flagship. His approach was textbook. 50 feet, 270 miles per hour. Machine guns blazing. The Japanese crew was firing back with everything they had. 20mm cannons, heavy machine guns, even rifles. The air between Johnson's bomber and the transport was solid with tracers. Johnson's bomb release was perfect. The weapon skipped once and punched through the transport's hull just forward of the bridge. The delay fuse gave it time to penetrate deep into the ship before detonating. The explosion tore through 3 decks. Fire erupted from the cargo holds. Larner knew what was in those holds. Ammunition, artillery shells, fuel drums. The transport became an inferno. Men were burning on deck, jumping into the sea trailing smoke. Lieutenant Paul Warren's bomber took hits during its approach. A Japanese gunner on one of the destroyers had finally adjusted for the low-altitude attack. 20mm shells ripped through Warren's port wing. Fuel streamed from the punctured tank. Warren held his course. 300 yards. 200. At 150 yards, he released. The bomb skipped and struck the transport below the waterline. Warren banked hard right, trailing fire. His co-pilot, Lieutenant Dave Miller, was already activating the fire suppression system. The flames died. The bomber was still flying. Barely. 6 transports burning or sinking. 2 destroyers damaged. 1 B-25 lost. The attack had lasted 4 minutes. The second wave was coming in. 9 more B-25s from the 90th Bomb Squadron, led by Major Ralph Chelly. They'd watched Larner's attack from 5 miles out. They knew the tactic worked. They knew the cost. Chelly's formation spread out, each bomber selecting a target from the ships still afloat. The Japanese were ready this time. Every gun in the convoy was tracking low. The destroyers had formed a defensive line, their main batteries firing in coordinated volleys. The ocean erupted with shell splashes. The barrage was intense, deadly, calculated. The Japanese had learned from the first attack. They would make the Americans pay for the second. Chelly's bomber came in from the east, directly into the sun. Smart. The Japanese gunners were half blind, firing at shadows. His bomb hit a transport that was already listing. The explosion accelerated the sinking. The ship rolled onto its side and went under in less than 2 minutes. 1,200 soldiers went down with it. Lieutenant Harold Jensen wasn't as lucky. His approach angle was wrong, too shallow, too fast. His bomb skipped 3 times, cleared the target destroyer entirely, and detonated harmlessly beyond the convoy. Jensen pulled up and circled for another run. The Japanese destroyer he'd missed tracked him the entire turn. When Jensen came around for his second pass, the destroyer was waiting. The first shell took off his port engine. The second hit the cockpit. Jensen's B-25 rolled inverted and crashed into the sea at 300 miles per hour. No explosion, just impact. The ocean swallowed the aircraft and kept moving. 2 bombers down, 7 transports sinking, 3 destroyers crippled. The battle had been raging for 8 minutes, and Larner realized with cold clarity that the Japanese still had 60 Zero fighters somewhere above the clouds. The Zeros appeared at 09:15, 18 of them, diving from 12,000 feet. Larner saw them through scattered clouds, silver shapes dropping toward the bombers like hawks on field mice. The P-38 Lightnings were supposed to keep them occupied. Something had gone wrong. Either the Lightnings were outnumbered, or the Japanese had committed a second fighter group nobody knew about. Larner's B-25 was vulnerable. Low on fuel, low on ammunition. The machine guns in his nose had maybe 200 rounds left. Not enough for a sustained dogfight. Not enough to hold off a determined Zero pilot who'd learned to respect American bombers the hard way. He pushed the throttles forward and dove to wave top height. 20 feet. 15. The propellers were churning salt spray. The Zeros split into 2 groups. Half stayed high to engage the P-38s. The other 9 went after the bombers. They came in fast, 400 miles per hour, firing their 20mm cannons from 1,000 yards out. Larner saw tracers arc past his canopy. Too close. He jinked left, then right, making himself a difficult target. Behind him, Staff Sergeant Tommy Blake was in the dorsal gun turret, firing short controlled bursts at the nearest Zero. The Japanese fighter broke off. Not damaged, just cautious. Lieutenant Warren's damaged bomber wasn't so lucky. A Zero latched onto his tail and stayed there. Warren tried every evasive maneuver he knew. Climbs, dives, hard banking turns that stressed his damaged wing. Nothing worked. The Zero pilot was good. Patient. He waited until Warren ran out of airspeed in a climbing turn, then fired a 2-second burst. Warren's starboard engine exploded. The bomber nosed over and went into the ocean. Larner saw 3 parachutes. 3 out of 5. Better than nothing. The Zeros pressed their attack for 6 minutes. Then, abruptly, they broke off and climbed. Larner couldn't figure it out until he saw why. The B-17s were coming back for a second pass at 10,000 feet. The Zeros had to choose. Attack the bombers below, or defend the convoy from above. They chose above. The heavy bombers were the bigger threat to what remained of the convoy. Larner used the reprieve to assess damage. His port engine was running rough. Oil pressure fluctuating. Fuel gauge showing 60%. Enough to make it back to Port Moresby. Maybe. He looked back at the convoy. 8 transports had been hit. 7 were sinking or already gone. The 8th was burning, but still afloat, trying to make way toward the New Britain coast. All 4 destroyers on the screening line were damaged. 2 were dead in the water, the other 2 were circling the burning transports, trying to pick up survivors. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea wasn't over. It was 0921. The initial attack had lasted 11 minutes. But the killing would continue for 3 more days. American bombers would return every 6 hours. PT boats would hunt survivors in lifeboats. The Japanese had committed 7,000 troops to this convoy. Fewer than 1,200 would make it to Leh. The rest would drown, burn, or die of exposure in the tropical sun. Larner set course for home. His formation was scattered across 30 miles of ocean. 4 bombers were confirmed lost, 20 men dead or missing. But the mission had worked. Skip bombing had proven itself in the most brutal way possible. The technique would be refined, standardized, taught to every bomber squadron in the Pacific. Within 6 months, Japanese commanders would abandon any attempt to move large convoys within range of Allied air power. The supply line to their forward bases would strangle. The war would turn. But Larner didn't know that yet. He only knew his fuel gauge was dropping, his engine was failing, and Port Moresby was 90 minutes away. He ordered his crew to dump everything not essential: ammunition, guns they couldn't use, tools, spare parts, anything to reduce weight. The B-25 was struggling to maintain altitude with one engine running rough. At 0100, Benz spotted land, the southern coast of New Guinea. They were on course. Barely. The port engine was shaking now, oil streaming from a crack in the housing. Temperature gauge climbing into the red. 5 more minutes, and it would seize completely. Larner feathered the port propeller and transferred all power to the starboard engine. The bomber slowed to 180 miles per hour, just above stall speed, just enough to stay airborne. The coast was getting closer. 40 miles, 30, 20. The engine held. Larner landed at Port Moresby at 11:17. The runway was lined with ground crews, mechanics, intelligence officers. Word had spread. The convoy had been hit hard. Nobody knew how hard. Larner cut the engines and sat in the cockpit for 30 seconds, hands still gripping the control yoke. Benz was silent beside him. Neither man moved. They'd been flying for 3 hours and 42 minutes. It felt like 3 days. The debrief lasted 2 hours. Larner and his surviving pilots sat in the operations tent while intelligence officers asked the same questions in different ways. How many ships hit? How many sinking? How many bombs released? How many aircraft lost? The officers were building a picture from fragments. 9 pilots had attacked. 5 had returned. Mitchell gone. Jensen gone. Warren in the water. His crew picked up by a Catalina flying boat. 2 men wounded. The reconnaissance photos arrived at 1300 hours. An Australian Beaufort had photographed the convoy from 15,000 feet at noon. The images told the story Larner's crew couldn't. 8 transports. 7 confirmed sunk or sinking. The 8th beached on the New Britain coast, burning. 4 destroyers. 2 sunk. 2 severely damaged and withdrawing toward Rabaul. Total time from first attack to last ship down, 3 hours. General Kenny arrived at Port Moresby at 1600 hours. He walked directly to the operations tent and spread the reconnaissance photos across the briefing table. He didn't congratulate anyone, didn't shake hands. He pointed at the burning transport beached on the coast and said, "Finish it." The Australian Beaufighters would make another run at dusk. Nothing could be allowed to reach Leh. Nothing. The second strike launched at 17:30. Larner didn't fly. His bomber needed a new engine. Instead, he stood on the runway and watched 9 fresh B-25s take off into the setting sun. They'd be over the target at dusk. The Japanese survivors would be trying to salvage what they could from the beached transport. They wouldn't expect another attack. They'd be wrong. The strike returned at 2000 hours. The beached transport was gone, sunk at its mooring. The 2 damaged destroyers had been caught trying to withdraw. Both hit, both sinking. The Japanese had started this operation with 16 ships. By nightfall on March 2nd, 14 were on the bottom of the Bismarck Sea. The remaining 2 destroyers limped into Rabaul at midnight, barely afloat. The cost in lives was catastrophic. 7,000 Japanese soldiers had embarked at Rabaul. Reconnaissance flights over the next 2 days counted approximately 900 survivors reaching the New Britain coast by lifeboat or swimming. American PT boats intercepted most of the lifeboats. Some survivors were rescued. Others were killed in the water. The distinction between combat and massacre blurred in those 3 days. Command ordered no quarter. The Japanese had machine-gunned American aircrew in parachutes. The Americans returned the favor to soldiers in lifeboats. Larner learned about it 3 days later. He didn't ask for details. Didn't want to know which PT boat crews had fired on lifeboats, which bomber crews had strafed survivors swimming for shore. The war had rules, until it didn't. The rules had stopped applying somewhere between Mitchell's bomber disintegrating and the last Japanese transport going under. Nobody talked about it. Nobody wrote it in after-action reports. It happened anyway. The final count came through on March 7th. Japanese losses: 8 transports sunk. 4 destroyers sunk. Approximately 3,000 troops drowned, another 1,500 killed by air attack, 1,200 reached Leh overland through the jungle. They arrived without weapons, without supplies, without organization. They were combat ineffective. The reinforcement operation had failed completely. American losses: 4 B-25s, 1 B-17, 2 P-38s, 13 aircrew killed, 6 wounded. Against an entire Japanese convoy, the exchange rate was absurdly one-sided. Skip bombing had worked, but it had worked because Larner's crews had been willing to fly straight at destroyers at 50 feet, while anti-aircraft fire turned the air into metal. Courage didn't cover it. Insanity was closer. Kenny called it the most decisive air-sea battle of the Pacific War. Admiral Yamamoto called it a disaster. The Japanese Navy immediately canceled all future large convoy operations within range of Allied land-based air power. The supply line to New Guinea was cut. The garrisons at Leh, Salamaua, and Madang would have to survive on what they had. They wouldn't survive long, but the Battle of the Bismarck Sea changed more than Japanese strategy. It changed how every air force in the world thought about attacking ships. The Americans refined skip bombing. The British adopted it. The Soviets copied it. By 1944, low-altitude bombing had become standard doctrine for maritime strike aircraft worldwide. Larner flew 16 more missions before rotating home in May. He never spoke publicly about the battle, never gave interviews, never wrote a memoir. He'd done what was necessary. That was enough. The question nobody could answer was simple. Would the same tactic work against a prepared enemy? The Japanese tested that question 3 months later. On June 3, 1943, American reconnaissance spotted another convoy forming at Rabaul. 6 transports, 8 destroyers. This time the Japanese ships sailed at night. This time they had 60 Zero fighters providing continuous air cover. This time, every destroyer carried additional 20mm anti-aircraft guns, specifically positioned to defend against low-altitude attacks. They'd learned from the Bismarck Sea. They'd adapted. The 5th Air Force attacked at dawn. 12 B-25s using skip bombing. The results were different. 2 transports hit. 1 destroyer damaged. 3 B-25s shot down. The exchange rate had shifted. The Japanese anti-aircraft defense had improved dramatically. Gunners who'd survived the Bismarck Sea had trained their replacements. They knew to track low. They knew to fire early. They knew to concentrate on the bombers during the final approach when the aircraft were committed and couldn't maneuver. The Americans adapted in return. By July, 5th Air Force mechanics had installed additional armor around the cockpit and engines. They'd increased the forward-firing armament to 12 50-caliber machine guns. Some B-25s carried 14 guns. The theory remained the same. Suppress defensive fire with overwhelming firepower during the approach. Give the enemy gunners no choice except take cover or die. The modification worked. On November 2, 1943, 38 B-25s attacked Rabaul Harbor in the largest skip bombing raid of the war. The harbor contained 18 warships. 30 received direct hits. 1 heavy cruiser sunk. 1 destroyer sunk. 2 auxiliary vessels destroyed. 16 merchant ships damaged or sinking. The raid lasted 18 minutes. American losses? 2 B-25s. The exchange rate had swung back in America's favor, but Rabaul proved something else. Skip bombing worked best against ships in confined waters, ships that couldn't maneuver freely, ships anchored in harbor or trapped in narrow straits. Against a convoy in open ocean, with room to maneuver and fighter cover overhead, the tactic was dangerous. Against ships at anchor, it was devastating. The British adopted skip bombing in late 1943. Royal Air Force Beaufighters equipped with the technique attacked German convoys off Norway. The results mirrored the Pacific experience. High casualties, high success rate. The Germans responded by adding more anti-aircraft guns to their merchant vessels and requiring convoys to sail only under heavy fighter escort. The cost of moving supplies by sea increased dramatically. The effectiveness decreased proportionally. The Soviets used skip bombing against German ships in the Black Sea and Baltic. Their technique was cruder: lower approach altitude, heavier bombs, less suppressive fire. The results were mixed. Some ships sunk. Many bombers lost. The Soviets had courage. They lacked the training and equipment refinement the Americans had developed through trial and error in the Pacific. By 1944, skip bombing had evolved beyond its original form. American tactics now included coordinated attacks. High-altitude bombers would attack first, forcing ships to maneuver. Fighters would strafe to suppress anti-aircraft fire. Then the skip bombers would come in low, while the defenses were distracted and disorganized. The multi-layered approach reduced losses while maintaining effectiveness. The statistics told the story. Between March 1943 and August 1945, American aircraft using skip bombing sank or severely damaged 212 Japanese vessels. The cost was 47 bombers lost, a kill ratio of 4.5 ships per bomber. For comparison, high-altitude bombing achieved a kill ratio of 0.3 ships per bomber. Skip bombing was 15 times more effective, but the human cost was harder to quantify. Skip bombing required crews to fly directly at ships bristling with weapons, maintaining a steady course while tracers filled the air around them. The psychological stress was immense. Pilots who flew skip bombing missions had shorter combat tours, higher rates of combat fatigue, more frequent medical groundings for stress-related conditions. The tactic worked. It also broke the men who flew it. Larner never flew skip bombing again after May 1943. He'd trained new crews, watched them take off on missions using the tactic he'd helped prove, watched some of them not come back. By war's end, he trained 62 pilots in skip bombing. 18 were killed in action. 23 were wounded. The mathematics were brutal. A 29% fatality rate, a 66% casualty rate including wounded, better than high-altitude bombing, worse than almost any other combat aviation role. The question military historians would debate for decades was whether skip bombing shortened the war. The answer was complicated. Skip bombing didn't win battles by itself, but it strangled Japanese supply lines, made reinforcement prohibitively expensive, forced the Japanese Navy to abandon large-scale convoy operations. Without supplies, garrisons withered. Without reinforcements, defensive positions became indefensible. The islands fell one by one. What remained certain was this. On March 2nd and 3rd, 1943, 9 B-25 bombers flying at 50 feet had destroyed an entire Japanese convoy in 15 minutes of sustained combat. The tactic had been banned twice, called suicide by everyone who heard it, proven effective by men willing to fly into walls of anti-aircraft fire because the alternative was letting 7,000 enemy soldiers reach their destination. The bombers that attacked the Bismarck Sea convoy were scrapped after the war. None survived as museum pieces. Major Ed Larner returned to the United States in June 1943. He was 31 years old. He'd flown 88 combat missions. He'd survived longer than most bomber pilots in the Pacific. The Army Air Force wanted him to train new crews, teach them what he'd learned, pass on the techniques that had worked. He refused. Larner requested and received a transfer to transport aircraft. He spent the rest of the war flying C-47s, moving supplies and personnel across the Pacific. No combat, no skip bombing. No more missions where he watched crews he'd trained die in aircraft he'd taught them to fly. He never explained the decision, never had to. Command understood. Some men could keep flying combat after what they'd seen. Others couldn't. There was no shame in either choice. He was promoted to lieutenant colonel in December 1943. He declined the promotion twice before accepting. He didn't want recognition. He wanted to finish the war and go home. He got his wish in September 1945. Japan surrendered. Larner mustered out 3 months later with a Distinguished Flying Cross, 2 Air Medals, and a Purple Heart from shrapnel wounds he'd never mentioned in any after-action report. Larner died in 1997 in Sacramento, California. He was 85 years old. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his military service in one sentence. It didn't mention the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, didn't mention skip bombing, didn't mention that he'd helped develop a tactic that changed naval warfare. He'd asked his family not to discuss it. They honored his request. General George Kenney received credit for skip bombing in most historical accounts. That was fine with Larner. Kenney had conceived the theory. Larner had just proven it worked. The distinction mattered to historians. It didn't matter to the pilots who flew the missions. They knew who'd led the first attack. They knew who'd trained them. They knew whose techniques kept them alive when Japanese gunners were tracking their approach at 50 feet. The B-25 Mitchell bomber became legendary partly because of skip bombing. The aircraft served in every theater of World War II, but its reputation was built in the Pacific, flying missions that shouldn't have been survivable. By war's end, B-25s had sunk more enemy shipping than any other bomber type. The technique Larner and his crews had proven in March 1943 became standard doctrine for every B-25 unit in the Pacific. No museum displays a B-25 specifically flown in the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. The aircraft were worn out by war's end. Most were scrapped for aluminum. A few survive in museums, restored to flying condition or displayed as static exhibits. The National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, has a B-25 Mitchell. So does the Smithsonian. Neither flew at the Bismarck Sea. But they represent the crews who did. The battle itself is largely forgotten outside military history circles. It doesn't have the name recognition of Midway or Guadalcanal. No major films were made about it. No famous photographs captured the moment. Just after-action reports, reconnaissance images, and the testimony of men who mostly chose not to talk about what they'd done. What remains is this. In March 1943, a group of American bomber crews proved that aircraft could sink ships by skipping bombs across water at 50 feet altitude. The tactic was called suicide, before they proved it worked. It was called genius afterward. The truth was somewhere between. It was desperation meeting innovation. It was men willing to try something untested because the tested methods weren't working. It was courage measured in the decision to maintain heading while anti-aircraft fire turned the air lethal. The Pacific War changed after the Bismarck Sea. Japanese convoys stopped sailing within range of Allied air power. Supply lines collapsed. Garrisons starved. Islands fell. The war moved closer to Japan, one island at a time, and the Japanese Navy couldn't stop it because they couldn't supply their forward positions. Skip bombing hadn't won the war by itself, but it had closed the supply route the Japanese needed to keep fighting. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor, hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you watching from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia? Our community stretches across the entire world. You're not just a viewer, you're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching. And thank you for making sure Ed Larner and his crews don't disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that happen.
The morning of June 22nd, 1941, Major Friedrich Weber stood on a railway platform in East Prussia, watching trainload after trainload of supplies roll eastward toward the Soviet border. He was 31 years old, from Cologne, where his father had worked as a clerk in a shipping company, and where Weber himself had studied logistics and transportation management before being commissioned into the Wehrmacht. He had spent the last 18 months as a supply officer, first in the Polish campaign and then in France, and he had been assigned to Army Group Center for the invasion of the Soviet Union that would begin in less than 2 hours. The trains passing him carried ammunition, fuel, food, spare parts, medical supplies, everything that 3 million German soldiers would need to sustain an invasion across thousands of kilometers of Soviet territory. Weber understood logistics in ways that most combat officers didn't. He knew that battles were won or lost based on whether supplies reached the soldiers who needed them. The most brilliant tactical maneuver meant nothing if the tanks ran out of fuel before reaching their objectives. The finest troops in the world became ineffective if they didn't have ammunition or food. Weber had studied military history, had read about Napoleon's invasion of Russia and how supply problems had contributed to that catastrophe, and he recognized uncomfortable parallels between 1812 and 1941 that German planning seemed to ignore. The fundamental problem was simple, but appeared unsolvable given the strategic constraints Germany faced. The Soviet Union was vast, with distances that dwarfed anything Germany had encountered in Poland or France. The infrastructure was primitive compared to Western Europe, with few paved roads and a railway system built to a different gauge than German railways. The plan required German forces to advance hundreds of kilometers in the first weeks of the campaign, moving faster than supply lines could be extended, operating on the assumption that captured Soviet supplies would supplement German logistics. And the entire system depended on German forces achieving decisive victories quickly, destroying Soviet armies in frontier battles and collapsing Soviet resistance before logistical constraints became binding. Weber had read the operational plans and had identified what he believed was a critical vulnerability. The plan called for armored spearheads to advance rapidly, penetrating deep into Soviet territory to encircle enemy forces, while infantry divisions followed behind to secure captured areas and consolidate gains. This created elongated supply lines, where supplies had to travel hundreds of kilometers from railheads to forward units. The plan assumed that these supply lines could be maintained using trucks, that captured Soviet rail infrastructure could be converted to German gauge quickly, and that Soviet resistance would collapse fast enough that the advancing German forces wouldn't outrun their logistics. Weber believed these assumptions were optimistic to the point of being delusional. The Wehrmacht had approximately 500,000 trucks available for the invasion, which sounded impressive until you calculated how many were needed to supply 3 million soldiers advancing across vast distances. Each truck convoy traveling from railhead to forward units consumed fuel during the journey, fuel that had to be transported by other trucks, creating a logistical loop where significant portions of supply capacity were consumed, just moving fuel to supply the trucks themselves. The Soviet rail gauge was wider than the German standard, which meant captured railways couldn't be used without either converting the gauge, a slow process requiring specialized equipment and labor, or using captured Soviet rolling stock, which meant depending on equipment that might be sabotaged or simply worn out. Most critically, the plan had no contingency for what would happen if Soviet resistance didn't collapse quickly, if the Red Army continued fighting despite catastrophic losses, if the campaign extended into winter without achieving decisive victory. Weber had raised these concerns with his superiors and had been told, sometimes explicitly and sometimes through cold silence, that indicated his opinions were unwelcome, that his job was to execute the plan, not to question it, that the operational genius of German commanders would overcome logistical constraints, and that questioning whether the invasion would succeed was defeatism that bordered on treason. So Weber did his job. He organized supply convoys. He coordinated with railway officials to schedule supply trains. He maintained inventories of ammunition and fuel and food. He calculated consumption rates and delivery schedules. And he watched as the invasion unfolded according to plan initially, with stunning tactical victories that seemed to validate the operational concept, while the logistical foundations slowly eroded in ways that weren't immediately visible, but that would eventually prove catastrophic. The first weeks of Operation Barbarossa were a tactical masterpiece. German armored spearheads penetrated hundreds of kilometers into Soviet territory. Massive encirclements at Minsk, Smolensk, and Kiev trapped hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers. Soviet air forces were destroyed in enormous numbers. The Red Army seemed on the verge of collapse. German commanders spoke confidently about ending the campaign before winter. Hitler was already planning the victory parade. But Weber saw different indicators. The trucks that were supposed to maintain supply lines were breaking down at rates higher than anticipated. Soviet roads, which were poor even by the standards of Eastern European infrastructure, disintegrated under heavy military traffic. Summer rains turned dirt roads into mud that trucks couldn't navigate. Fuel consumption exceeded projections because vehicles traveled longer distances than planned, and because off-road movement consumed more fuel than movement on paved roads. Spare parts for trucks became scarce because the supply system prioritized ammunition and fuel over maintenance materials. The advance itself consumed supplies faster than they could be delivered. Armored units that raced ahead of supply convoys ran out of fuel and had to wait for resupply before continuing operations. Infantry divisions that were supposed to march behind the armored spearheads increasingly relied on trucks for movement because the distances were too great to cover on foot at the pace the plan required. Artillery units expended ammunition at rates that exceeded supply because Soviet resistance, while often ineffective tactically, required sustained firepower to suppress. Weber's unit, responsible for supply operations in a sector of Army Group Center, struggled to maintain delivery schedules. They worked 18-hour days, improvising solutions to problems that hadn't been anticipated. When trucks broke down, they cannibalized parts from other vehicles. When fuel ran short, they prioritized deliveries to combat units and left support units immobilized. When captured Soviet railways couldn't be converted quickly enough, they organized massive horse-drawn supply columns like something from a previous century. The system worked, barely, held together by the desperate efforts of logistics personnel who understood that failure meant soldiers at the front would go without ammunition or food. But working barely wasn't good enough for the strategic objectives. By August, barely 2 months into the campaign, the advance had slowed noticeably, not because German forces were being defeated tactically, but because they were outrunning their logistics. Panzer divisions sat idle waiting for fuel. Infantry divisions rationed ammunition because resupply wasn't arriving on schedule. The Luftwaffe reduced sortie rates because aviation fuel was scarce at forward airfields. The symptom was slower operational tempo. The cause was supply lines that were stretched beyond sustainability. Weber documented these problems in reports to higher command. He included detailed calculations showing that truck attrition meant that supply capacity was declining week by week, that fuel consumption for supply operations was consuming increasing percentages of available fuel, that the railway conversion was proceeding too slowly to compensate for declining truck capacity, and that the entire system would collapse unless the advance was paused to allow logistics to catch up. His reports were acknowledged but ignored. The operational commanders didn't want to hear about logistical constraints. They believed that one more offensive, one more encirclement, would break Soviet resistance and end the campaign. Logistics could catch up after victory was achieved. The decision to continue offensive operations despite logistical constraints, made repeatedly by German commanders from Hitler down through Army and Army Group commanders during the summer and fall of 1941, was the mistake that would cost Germany the Eastern Front. Not a single dramatic error, but a pattern of choices that prioritized immediate tactical gains over sustainable operations, that ignored logistical realities in pursuit of operational objectives, that assumed problems would resolve themselves through victory rather than requiring systematic solutions. The consequences became apparent during the advance on Moscow in October and November. Army Group Center launched Operation Typhoon, the offensive intended to capture the Soviet capital before winter. The operation achieved initial tactical success, encircling more Soviet forces and advancing to within sight of Moscow's outskirts. But the logistical situation had deteriorated to crisis levels. Supply lines now stretched from railheads in Poland and western Russia to forward units hundreds of kilometers away. Truck attrition meant that available transport capacity was perhaps half what it had been in June. Fuel shortages were acute, with panzer divisions receiving enough fuel for only limited operations. Ammunition supply was irregular, with some units oversupplied while others ran critically short. And then winter arrived. Not gradually, but suddenly, with temperatures dropping from autumn cool to below freezing in days. The German army was unprepared. Winter equipment, winter clothing, antifreeze for vehicles, cold weather lubricants, all the materials needed for winter operations had not been prioritized because the campaign was supposed to end before winter. Some of these supplies existed in depots in Germany, but moving them to the front required transport capacity that was already inadequate for moving basic supplies like ammunition and fuel. So German soldiers fought in uniforms designed for temperate weather, operated vehicles that froze and wouldn't start, used weapons that malfunctioned in extreme cold, and suffered from frostbite and cold weather injuries that reduced combat effectiveness as much as enemy action did. Weber watched as the supply system that he and thousands of other logistics personnel had struggled to maintain through the summer and fall finally collapsed under the combined weight of overstretched supply lines, inadequate transport capacity, winter weather, and Soviet counterattacks that disrupted rear areas. Convoys that had been traveling from railheads to forward units in 3 days now took a week or couldn't complete the journey at all, because vehicles broke down in cold weather or because Soviet partisans attacked isolated supply columns. Railways that were supposed to deliver supplies to forward railheads couldn't operate because locomotives froze or because tracks were sabotaged. Supply dumps at railheads became bottlenecks, where supplies accumulated but couldn't be moved forward because trucks weren't available or couldn't operate in winter conditions. The operational impact was immediate and severe. German units at the front ran out of supplies. Soldiers went on reduced rations, sometimes eating only once per day. Ammunition was rationed strictly, with artillery fires prohibited except for defensive emergencies. Fuel shortages immobilized vehicles, turning panzer divisions into static defensive positions. Medical supplies ran out, meaning wounded soldiers couldn't be treated adequately. The offensive toward Moscow stalled not because Soviet defenses were impregnable, but because German forces physically couldn't continue attacking without supplies. And then the Soviets counterattacked. In December 1941, Soviet forces that had been held in reserve launched offensives along multiple sectors of the front, hitting German forces that were exhausted, undersupplied, and frozen. German units retreated, sometimes in panic, abandoning equipment they couldn't move because there was no fuel, leaving behind wounded they couldn't evacuate, suffering catastrophic losses from cold as much as from combat. The retreat was chaotic and costly, stopped only by desperate defensive stands and Hitler's orders forbidding further withdrawal. Weber's unit retreated with the rest of Army Group Center, abandoning supply dumps that couldn't be evacuated, destroying stocks of ammunition and fuel rather than leaving them for Soviet forces, trying to maintain some semblance of organized logistics in conditions that were beyond anything they had prepared for. The experience was traumatic for logistics personnel who had worked desperately to keep the supply system functioning, and who now watched as that system collapsed despite their efforts, not because they had failed at their jobs, but because they had been given an impossible task with inadequate resources. The winter crisis of 1941–42 was survived, barely. German forces stabilized the front, held defensive positions through the winter, and recovered enough by spring to resume limited offensive operations. But the fundamental logistical problems that had caused the crisis hadn't been solved. The supply system was still dependent on inadequate truck capacity. Railways were still limited by gauge conversion bottlenecks. Supply lines were still stretched across vast distances. And the Wehrmacht's operational planning still prioritized tactical and operational objectives over logistical sustainability. Weber spent the winter of 1941–42 in a supply depot near Smolensk, organizing the consolidation and redistribution of supplies that had accumulated in rear areas because they couldn't be moved to the front. He worked in unheated buildings, wore every piece of clothing he owned, suffered from minor frostbite that was treated as insignificant compared to the cases of severe frostbite that resulted in amputations, and thought constantly about how this disaster could have been prevented. The answer was obvious, but unpalatable. The invasion should have been designed around logistical capabilities rather than operational desires. The advance should have been paused when supply lines became overstretched, rather than continuing in hope that victory would be achieved before logistics became binding. Winter preparations should have been prioritized, even if that meant reducing ammunition or fuel allocations. Truck production should have been increased, and truck attrition should have been reduced through better maintenance and less demanding operational tempo. None of these corrective measures were implemented systematically. Some improvements were made. Truck production increased modestly. Railway conversion accelerated. Supply procedures were refined based on hard experience, but the fundamental approach didn't change. German planning continued to assume that operational brilliance could overcome logistical constraints, that tactical victories would create conditions where supply problems became manageable, and that the Wehrmacht could sustain operations on inadequate logistics through improvisation and the extraordinary efforts of personnel at all levels. The summer offensive of 1942, Operation Blue, demonstrated that German leadership had learned nothing from the previous year's logistical crisis. The plan called for a massive offensive toward the Caucasus oil fields and Stalingrad, operations that would extend supply lines even further than the 1941 advance on Moscow, across terrain that was even more primitive, with objectives that were hundreds of kilometers from existing rail infrastructure. Weber, now a lieutenant colonel responsible for supply operations for an entire army corps, read the operational plans with mounting horror. The logistical requirements were staggering, and the available resources were inadequate. But when he raised concerns, he received the same responses he'd gotten in 1941. Execute the plan, don't question it. Trust that operational success would create conditions where logistics could catch up. The offensive initially succeeded tactically, achieving the usual spectacular encirclements and territorial gains. But by August 1942, the same pattern as 1941 was repeating. Supply lines overstretched, truck attrition reduced transport capacity, fuel shortages slowed operations, forward units outran their logistics, and the response from higher command was the same: continue attacking, victory is close, logistics can be sustained with improvisation. Weber's corps reached the Volga River north of Stalingrad in September 1942. The advance had covered more than 1,000 kilometers in less than 4 months. The supply line from the corps' railhead to its forward units was over 600 kilometers, most of it on roads that were barely passable. Maintaining this supply line required every available truck, operating continuously, and still wasn't sufficient to deliver everything the corps needed. Fuel arrived irregularly. Ammunition supply was prioritized, but that meant other supplies, including food and winter clothing, were deferred. Maintenance parts were scarce, which meant vehicles that broke down often couldn't be repaired. The absurdity of the situation was that Weber's corps was considered well supplied compared to some German units. There were units that had been cut off from supply entirely for days at a time, units that were reduced to captured Soviet stocks for ammunition and food, units that had no fuel at all and were effectively immobilized. The Wehrmacht was operating on the edge of logistical collapse across the entire southern front, sustained only by the desperate improvisations of logistics personnel and by the fact that Soviet forces were also suffering from logistical problems. When the Soviets launched Operation Uranus in November 1942, encircling the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad, the immediate cause was tactical. Soviet forces broke through Romanian armies that were weak and poorly equipped. But the underlying cause was logistical. The Romanian armies were weak because Germany couldn't supply them adequately. They held critical positions, not because they were the best forces available, but because German forces were committed elsewhere and couldn't be repositioned without solving logistical problems that hadn't been solved. When the encirclement closed, trapping 300,000 German and Romanian soldiers in the Stalingrad pocket, the response was to attempt air supply, as if logistics problems could be solved by flying supplies in rather than by building sustainable ground supply lines. Weber, whose corps was west of the encirclement and participated in failed relief attempts, watched the Stalingrad disaster unfold with a sense of inevitability. The airlift couldn't work because the tonnage requirements were impossible to meet with available aircraft, and because winter weather made flying unreliable. The relief attempts couldn't succeed because the forces committed didn't have adequate fuel or ammunition to sustain offensive operations over the required distances. The encircled Sixth Army couldn't break out because it had no fuel for its vehicles, and because Hitler forbade abandoning positions. Every decision made the situation worse, and every decision was made necessary by the fundamental logistical failures that had accumulated since June 1941. The Sixth Army's destruction at Stalingrad in February 1943 marked the turning point of the Eastern Front, the moment when German defeat became probable rather than merely possible. But the causes of that turning point were rooted in decisions made in 1941 and 1942, decisions to prioritize operational objectives over logistical sustainability, to ignore supply constraints in pursuit of victory, to assume that problems would resolve themselves rather than requiring systematic solutions. Stalingrad was the symptom. The disease was the Wehrmacht's approach to logistics, which treated supply as a problem to be overcome through improvisation rather than as a fundamental constraint that should shape operational planning. Weber spent 1943 and 1944 in increasingly desperate attempts to maintain supply lines during the German retreat westward. The logistical problems didn't improve, they got worse. Soviet advances overran supply depots and railways. Allied bombing destroyed factories and transportation networks in Germany. Fuel production declined as synthetic fuel plants were bombed and as Romanian oil fields were lost. Truck production couldn't keep pace with losses, and the Wehrmacht continued operating as if these constraints didn't exist, launching counterattacks that consumed scarce supplies without achieving sustainable results, holding positions that created supply bottlenecks, refusing to shorten lines to reduce logistical strain. The retreat itself created new supply challenges that were even more difficult than supporting offensive operations. Retreating units needed fuel to move. They needed ammunition to fight delaying actions. They needed food to survive. But the supply system was optimized for moving supplies forward to advancing units, not for supporting fighting withdrawals. Supplies accumulated in depots that were overrun by Soviet advances before they could be evacuated. Units became separated from their supply trains and had to scavenge from abandoned stocks. The organization of the supply system fragmented as formations were broken up and reconstituted repeatedly. Weber was promoted to colonel in 1944 and given responsibility for supply operations for an entire army, not because of any particular achievement, but because so many senior logistics officers had been killed, captured, or transferred that experienced personnel were scarce. He was responsible for supplying approximately 100,000 soldiers with everything they needed to conduct operations across a front that stretched hundreds of kilometers. The job was impossible with the resources available, but it was his job, so he did it to the best of his abilities. The constant tension was between what units needed, what he could realistically supply, and what higher command ordered him to deliver. Units needed winter clothing, fuel, ammunition, food, medical supplies, spare parts, replacements for destroyed equipment. Weber could supply perhaps 60% of stated requirements, and often less, because transport capacity was inadequate, because supplies weren't available in depots, because Soviet advances disrupted delivery routes. Higher command ordered him to supply 100% of requirements and to prioritize offensive operations over defensive preparations, to deliver fuel for counterattacks rather than stockpiling supplies for retreats, to maintain forward supply dumps in positions that would obviously be overrun within days. The gap between what was ordered and what was possible created constant friction. Weber argued with his superiors about realistic supply capabilities. He documented the constraints, the number of operational trucks, the fuel consumption for supply operations, the tonnage that could move through available railways, the time required to establish new supply dumps when old ones were abandoned. His arguments were generally ignored or dismissed as defeatism. Operational commanders didn't want to hear that their planned operations couldn't be adequately supplied. They wanted logistics to support operations, not operations to be constrained by logistics. The institutional failure to integrate logistics into operational planning, the mistake that cost Germany the Eastern Front, persisted until the end. In 1945, as Soviet forces advanced into Germany itself, Wehrmacht units launched counterattacks with inadequate supplies, held positions they couldn't sustain, and retreated in chaos when logistics collapsed. The pattern that had started in 1941, advancing beyond sustainable supply lines and assuming that victory would solve logistical problems, continued even when victory was impossible and when the only rational strategy was to shorten lines and conserve resources for extended defense. Weber surrendered to Soviet forces in May 1945 near Prague. His army had disintegrated during the final Soviet offensive, with units fragmenting and soldiers either surrendering or attempting to escape westward to surrender to American forces instead. Weber stayed with the remnants of his supply train until Soviet tanks overran their position, then surrendered along with his staff. He was marched east to a prisoner collection point, then transported to a prisoner camp in the Soviet Union where he would spend the next 9 years. The prisoner camp experience was miserable, but Weber survived it through the same methodical approach that had characterized his work as a supply officer. He conserved energy, avoided conflicts, did whatever work was assigned without complaint, and maintained his health as well as circumstances allowed. He used his logistics expertise to improve camp organization, helping Soviet administrators establish more efficient distribution of food and supplies to prisoners, which earned him minor privileges that improved his survival chances. During the long years in the camp, Weber thought constantly about what had gone wrong, about the mistakes that had cost Germany the war and had cost millions of lives. The analysis was straightforward. Germany had attempted to conquer the Soviet Union with inadequate logistical preparation, had ignored supply constraints during operational planning, had prioritized tactical and operational objectives over sustainable logistics, and had continued these practices even after their consequences became catastrophically obvious. The specific mistake that cost Germany the Eastern Front, the single decision that Weber identified as the most consequential, was the decision in June 1941 to invade without solving the fundamental logistical problems that made sustaining operations across vast Soviet distances impossible with available resources. Every subsequent failure flowed from that initial mistake. If German planning had designed the invasion around logistical capabilities rather than operational desires, if supply lines had been kept short enough to maintain, if offensives had been paused when logistics became overstretched, if resources had been allocated to building sustainable logistics instead of to expanding offensive operations beyond supportable limits, the outcome would have been different. Not necessarily a German victory, because the Soviet Union's resources and determination might have prevailed regardless. But certainly a different war, one where German forces maintained combat effectiveness longer, where tactical victories could be exploited sustainably, where retreats could be conducted in organized fashion rather than in panicked flight, where supplies remained adequate for troops at the front. A war where logistics supported operations rather than constantly constraining them, and eventually causing operational collapse. Weber was released from Soviet captivity in 1954 and returned to West Germany. He found employment with a transportation company, using his logistics expertise in civilian industry. He married, had children, built a quiet life. He rarely spoke about his war experiences, partly because the subject was painful, and partly because he understood that most people weren't interested in logistics, that they wanted to hear about combat and heroism, not about supply calculations and transportation schedules. But occasionally, when speaking with other veterans or when asked by his children about the war, Weber would explain what he had learned, that logistics matter more than tactics, that supply constraints determine what operations are possible, that ignoring logistics doesn't make them irrelevant, but rather ensures they will eventually cause failure, and that the single biggest mistake Germany made in the Eastern Front was invading without adequate logistical preparation, and then continuing operations beyond sustainable supply limits in pursuit of tactical victories that couldn't be consolidated into strategic success, because the logistics didn't exist to support consolidation. The lesson is relevant beyond the specific historical circumstances of the Eastern Front. Military organizations throughout history have failed because they ignored logistics, assumed that operational brilliance could overcome supply constraints, prioritized offensive operations over sustainable logistics, and continued failing strategies because admitting mistakes was psychologically or politically impossible. Businesses fail for similar reasons, expanding beyond their logistical capabilities, assuming that tactical success in markets will solve supply chain problems, ignoring constraints until those constraints cause collapse. The fundamental principle that Weber learned through bitter experience is that logistics define the envelope of possible operations, that success requires operating within logistical constraints rather than assuming constraints can be overcome through willpower or tactical skill, and that organizations that ignore this principle will eventually fail regardless of other advantages they possess. The Wehrmacht in 1941 had tactical superiority, operational skill, technological advantages, and motivated personnel. But it invaded the Soviet Union with inadequate logistics, continued operations beyond sustainable supply limits, and paid the ultimate price of organizational destruction. The trains that Weber watched rolling eastward on June 22, 1941, carried enough supplies for the initial offensive, but not for sustained operations across thousands of kilometers of Soviet territory. The mistake wasn't the supplies that were loaded onto those trains. The mistake was the decision to invade when the logistical infrastructure didn't exist to sustain the invasion, when the operational plan exceeded logistical capabilities, when victory required everything going perfectly, and logistics ensured that nothing would go perfectly. That mistake, made by Hitler and the German High Command in their planning for Operation Barbarossa, cost Germany the Eastern Front because it created conditions where tactical victories couldn't be translated into strategic success, and where the Wehrmacht would progressively weaken while Soviet forces recovered and eventually achieved overwhelming superiority. Weber died in 1983 in Germany, having lived long enough to see 2 generations grow up after the war. His professional legacy was modest: a successful career in civilian logistics, some innovations in transportation management, a comfortable retirement. His personal legacy was a family that knew him as a father and grandfather who was quiet about his past, but who occasionally shared insights about planning, about the importance of understanding constraints, about the dangers of assuming that problems will solve themselves if ignored. But his historical legacy, though he never sought recognition for it, was understanding one of the most important lessons of World War II, that Germany lost the Eastern Front not primarily because of Soviet tactical or operational superiority, not because German soldiers lacked courage or skill, not because of winter weather or vast distances or any single battle or campaign, but because German planning made logistical sustainability subordinate to operational ambition, and then persisted in that mistake for 4 years while it consumed the Wehrmacht. The supply line mistakes weren't dramatic single decisions that can be pointed to as decisive moments. They were patterns of choices, repeated constantly at every level from strategic planning to tactical execution, that created conditions where German forces were always operating on inadequate logistics, where tactical success couldn't be sustained, where retreats became necessary because supplies ran out, and where eventual defeat became inevitable because the logistical foundations of military power had been neglected in pursuit of operational objectives that couldn't be achieved or maintained without those foundations. That's how one supply line mistake cost Germany the Eastern Front. Not one dramatic error, but one fundamental misunderstanding of the relationship between logistics and operations. One decision to prioritize operational desires over logistical reality. One pattern of choices that was repeated until it caused organizational collapse. The mistake could have been corrected at multiple points between 1941 and 1945, but it never was, because correcting it would have required admitting that the invasion had been planned incorrectly, that operational objectives were unrealistic, that logistics mattered more than tactics, and that German leadership had made fundamental errors in judgment. And those admissions were psychologically and politically impossible for the Nazi leadership and the Wehrmacht command that served it. So the mistakes continued, the supply problems multiplied, the Wehrmacht weakened progressively, and Germany lost the Eastern Front, not through defeat in any single battle, but through the accumulated consequences of logistical failures that were present from the beginning and that were never adequately addressed. Friedrich Weber understood this. He had watched it happen, had tried to prevent it within his limited authority, had documented the problems and proposed solutions that were ignored, and had ultimately survived to witness the collapse he had predicted. His knowledge didn't change the outcome because individual understanding couldn't correct institutional failures, but it provides insight into how organizations fail when they ignore fundamental constraints, assume that determination and skill can overcome material limitations, and persist in failing strategies because acknowledging failure is more difficult than continuing the mistakes that cause failure.